Hi, everyone. Good to see you again. Not that I can see you, but you can see me. And I hope you're doing well. Good news last week about the roadmap out of lockdown. Hope that's given you a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. And we were playing some sport on Tuesday afternoon. It was lovely to see one or two of you there. And we'll probably try and do something again like that this week. So check out particularly the Facebook page. If you're not part of that, then find us Edinburgh Navigators, Edinburgh Student Navigators on Facebook. That's got information on there, and we'll post stuff on there when we can and circulate it around for you. This week, Sam, we're going to look at Psalm 62. And as always, start with the titles because they're always quite interesting. Again, we've got the choir master was in the title, which again suggests that it was went for public worship where people gathered together and sung, part of the worship of Israel. It's got another aspect to it, according to Jeduthun. Now, who was Jeduthun? It seems that he was one of the guys that David appointed to be the chief musicians at the temple. Probably led the choir or the singing or something like that. Heads of public worship when people gathered and sang. In 1 Chronicles 25, verse 1, it says this: he was appointed to prophesy during the worship times. Now, this is a surprising word to use in with respect to music and worship. And the word prophecy might just kind of get your radar going. Just it might be another word which just means weirdness to you. But a prophet was simply somebody who spoke authoritatively what God wanted his people to hear. And I reckon this maybe meant that Jeduthun's role in worship at the temple was to lead God's people by sensitively selecting appropriate music and lyrics that reflected what he thought God wanted them to hear at the time. He would have maybe gone through a process of praying and meditating on what do people need to reflect on, what do they need to sing, what lyrics speak to them at this particular time. And I think then that imagines a scenario where people didn't just turn up to belt out their favorite hymns or worship songs to a band, but the idea is much more that they gathered to respond to God through these songs and music. So it's actually really interesting. It imagines a much less passive role for people in worship than maybe we're used to thinking about. And I think that's a really nice picture. It kind of brings it to life. The people aren't just there to sing, they're responding to what God is saying to them through the music and the lyrics. And then finally, we've got a Psalm of David, and we've been through this before. Could have been written by David. Many think it was. It could have been in the style of or a tribute to David or something about him, connected to him. So into the Psalm itself. And the one thing I want to highlight from the start is something that the English translations make it a little bit harder to see. But the first words in each line are really prominent in this psalm. And for the first half of this psalm, every opening line begins with the same, every line begins with the same word except for one. And that it's a Hebrew word, it's like ak is how it sounds, if I've got the pronunciation right. And it just means alone or only. So every verse starts with that except one. And then the second half of the psalm, none of the verses have that except for verse 9. So there's a kind of symmetry to there going on. And as we start, can illustrate this, the first 2 verses or the first stanza, which is kind of a group of verses in a psalm, they say almost literally this, and I've done my own translation to kind of draw out. It's only in God does my soul wait silently. From him is my deliverance. And then the second line, only he is my rock and salvation. He is my fortress, I will not be overthrown. So you can see the kind of emphasis in that first line, only. And you can see this whole psalm, therefore, it kind of it centers around this phrase, only, this term, only. And in this opening stanza, we get the message that only God can do something. He alone can be the focus of our hearts, because only he is capable of meeting our needs. Only he is worthy of our dependence. And then as you move on through the psalm, remember this only theme, we get to verses 3 and 4. And again, the English kind of masked this a little bit, but it starts the same line, and roughly it's translated, only their thought is to drive a person from his high place. That's verse 3. And so, in contrast to God, in whom we can have confidence, we've got the idea that there's this people who only know, or their only intention is to knock me down. So it kind of brings the idea of a life which is centered on confidence in God. And then in contrast to that, a life which has no basis for confidence in God, and probably the opposite, it brings threat to life. And then as we return to, as we go to verse 5 and 6, it's interesting. We see kind of two lines which are almost exactly the same as those opening two lines, that only phrases, only in God can you have confidence, except it repeats it almost verbatim, but there's slight differences. So in verse 1, it said, only in God does my soul wait silently, from him is my deliverance. Verse 5 is the slight difference, and it reads a bit like this: only in God my soul waits silently. So there's almost an urging from the writer. It's kind of, first line's verse 1's a statement. It's just there. Verse 5, almost the same words, but here it's a call for his soul to act on that confidence. He's telling his soul what to do, whereas before it was only a meditation or an intention or an ideal. Here he's saying to do it. And just a side note, if in the Bible you see something which is almost word for word, but there's slight tiny differences, don't assume that that's a kind of copying error. Often what's going on is that there are a very subtle way of highlighting something. So in this case, for example, I think it's just intensifying the idea that was there in verse 1 and 2. It's intensifying it in verse 5 and 6 in some ways. And I'm not going to tell you, but I think there's a couple of other slight changes in verse 5 and 6 compared to 1 and 2. Just do you notice them, and what would your theory be? I'll kind of leave that for you. But I reckon what's going on is that the point of these two kind of mirror images with slight differences is that whereas the first original statement is true, then what goes on is that we find out how true it is when we choose to put our confidence in God in the midst of threat or trouble. And that's the threat and trouble is the theme of the verse in between, verses 3 and 4. So that's just my theory, but I think that's what it's saying, is that we learn more about the truth of who God is in the midst of trouble or threat, and we choose to put our trust in him. And that's good news for us, actually, because this psalm, it means this psalm's not just a comforting idea in the abstract, but it's actually for practicing in the real world where things get hard. So after verses 5 and 6, which is that kind of echo of 1 and 2, we go back to our only word, and verse 9 begins with this word only again. And it's like this. It says, again, I've translated it, only a vain sigh or a breath are the sons of Adam. Interesting word here. This I've said vain sigh or a breath. The word is actually, it's hevel, and if you read Ecclesiastes at all, you'll be familiar with the idea of meaningless, everything is meaningless. And the word meaningless, the same word, it's hevel. And it just translates as it's a breath. It's something that has no substance. It's like a vapor that dissipates as soon as it's left your mouth and it goes into the air, it's gone. And that's the idea here. And it's helpful because then when it goes on to talking about scales or balances in the next couple of verses, you get the idea of balances like the old scales, which was kind of pivoted on there, and then you put something down on one end, it went up on the other. It's the idea here, when you put this kind of breath or whatever this thing is on one side, you'd expect when you put something on some scales, it would begin to weigh it down. You put this hevel, this breath on one side of the scales, and actually it goes up. It's so insignificant. It's so lacking substance. And that's just what it's saying here. No weight or substance. So again, we have a contrast. And when it comes to verse 10, we see this brought out again when it says don't trust. We've got a trust and don't trust contrast in the psalm itself. But in verse 10, it says don't trust in humans or human approval or human wealth, because they're not worthy, they're not capable of ultimate trust, the same ultimate trust that we put in God. And actually, people who believe that these things are substantial enough, they will always end up making compromises really they never imagined making. And that is hinted at by greedily chasing after wealth, or compromising yourself, perhaps by being dishonest. So there we go. Final two verses. Just to explain them slightly, you've got this one thing I have heard. So one thing God has spoken, two things I have heard. Really, that's kind of a Hebrew idiom, which is the effect of saying God has spoken something, but God's word is so rich that I hear or I learn so much more that's life-giving. And it says, I've heard one thing you've spoken, two things I've heard, and it kind of elaborates on that. And here are the particular things that the writer reflects on is both the substance and the power of God and the love of God as well. And he's probably reflecting on what he's been hearing in the psalm itself, that one thing, maybe that one message, that one word of God. He has two reflections on it, and that is that God is a God of power and substance, but he's also a God of love as well. And in case you're not comfortable, I thought it's worth commenting on the final verse, which the final sentence, which seems to indicate that God gives to people what they have earned. And so some of us will be uncomfortable with that because we've been taught that grace is undeserved, that God saves us because he loves us, never because we merit his love. And that's true. The New Testament teaches that. And you might think there's a contradiction here. But actually, this sentence is not addressing the same themes as in the New Testament. In fact, what it's saying is that we can trust God as the one that we can completely rely on. If we wait patiently on him, we can trust him to come through for us. And the contrast is the one who tries to get ahead in life by relying on themselves or by dishonest gain, to basically looking at human riches or approval. That in the end, God will not allow that mentality to prevail. But if you wait patiently for him and trust him, then God will reward that. You can trust him if you wait on him. So great psalm, lots of reflections, but very much the theme is trusting God as opposed to trusting in yourself and human wealth and that kind of thing. And it's just a wonderful way that the psalm develops and takes you on a journey there. And I hope you guys really enjoy studying it. Have fun. See you next week.